So I think I've been very unfair to the New Republic in the past. I think a lot of people are very unfair to the New Republic. I've been reading a lot of extended universe stuff lately, and I've gotten a lot better look at what the New Republic was like, how it was governed, how it functioned, and kind of a more fair comparison to the Empire. So I think there's kind of given it's kind of a give and take if you're comparing the two. In some ways the New Republic performs a lot better than the Empire. In other ways it performs much worse. And this kind of comes down to a contrast, as I've talked about in the past, between centralized and decentralized states. Decentralized states are often more stable and have kind of are easier to maintain territorial integrity, but they're much less able to fully utilize their resources, whereas very centralized states are able to maximize their use of resources. At the same time, though, they can become very unstable because power is so concentrated. It's very easy for a palace coup or some kind of regime change to come along. Makes sense. So before we kind of talk about the contrast between the two, I want to kind of dive a little into the concept of legitimacy. So legitimacy is how whether or not the people view the government or just there are factors that the government has that makes them in the eyes of the public. Let's see, where's some synonyms: lawful, justifiable, appropriate, accepted, sanctioned, recognized, etc. They're things that make the public accept the government as being natural and having basically the right to rule. And legitimacy is extremely important because it's a non-force related way of kind of maintaining control. So societies with a lot of legitimacy, like say America, don't have to rely on force to maintain control of the country. Like if America was to send all of its military overseas, at least in this era, it wouldn't really be in danger of local warlords springing up or states seceding or that kind of thing happening. The only time that really happened was during the Civil War, and that was due to a whole bunch of stuff we aren't going to get into. But for most of America's history, there hasn't really been this danger of military coups or the government being overthrown or widespread separatism, aside from the Civil War era. That's because the American government enjoys a lot of legitimacy. A lot of states enjoy a lot, and they don't immediately have to worry about these things. Now, in contrast, you have states that are solely based on rule by force. The government doesn't have any legitimacy beyond what it can achieve by repressing the population actively through the military. And this was a problem a lot of Arab states had, and this came about during the Arab-Israeli wars, where the Israeli government had a lot of legitimacy. There was no fear of a military coup or a civil war, so the Israeli government was able to give a lot of power to its generals. They basically gave them whatever resources they needed and trusted them to act in the best interest of Israel. Whereas in the Arab states, armies were extremely centralized. They wouldn't let commanders talk to each other. They would intentionally deny battlefield commanders intelligence, weapons, or reinforcements because there was such a lack of legitimacy in the government that there was a constant fear of military coups, and it made them perform really poorly in wars just because they were military dictatorships and they were unwilling to really cede the authority to field commanders they needed to conduct it. Also, because there was no inherent legitimacy within the government, like I said, there wouldn't really be one illegitimate government being replaced by another. The people don't really care because neither one of them is legitimate. Now, going to kind of a society that really understood that, let's talk a bit about Napoleon. Now, Napoleon, I think, really understood that in the aftermath of the French Revolution, you had successive military and socialist dictatorships which had zero legitimacy. They were just forms of government that were completely invented and only maintained power. Like the Jacobins maintained power just by killing all their opponents. The couple elections they had during the French Revolution, the royalists, or like the center right, actually won. So they had to keep overthrowing the democratically elected government and instituting another republican dictatorship. So I think what Napoleon realized was, and we're going to get into how this all ties into the New Republic, don't worry. What Napoleon realized is he needed legitimacy. He needed something beyond just being another military tyrant. So he made himself emperor. Now, the French understand monarchy. France has been a monarchy from the time it was founded under Clovis up until like a decade or two before Napoleon. So people understood this. There was this idea that monarchy was a regularization of kind of dictatorship. That by making himself emperor, Napoleon was kind of tying himself to institutions, to traditions, to kind of a consistent form of government. That there would, when he died, it wasn't just based on personal charisma. There would be an ordered succession. His son or chosen successor would become emperor after him, and there would be certain defined powers of the office. So he did that. He created the Legion of Honor and a lot of new titles of nobility. So he created kind of a functional upper ruling class. It wasn't just him. He was creating a kind of an elite that would govern the country kind of independently of him. So you had that. He reinstituted the National Assembly. Now it was not particularly democratic as we refer to it today. I think it was elected by like middle class and up suffrage, and it was very subject to executive power, but there was a definitive role for the public. The public was allowed to participate in policy discussions and to make their concerns heard. And that goes a long way towards legitimacy. If people feel, it doesn't have to be mass democracy in a modern sense, but if people have a way to make their concerns heard and to seek redress for their problems, that goes a long way in making people accept a government. So we had that. We also had the regularization of laws, just society. There came to be a certain degree of predictability to society, which is extremely important. And Napoleon provided very kind of competent, like I said, sane government. So the French people, his regime succeeded much more because he understood legitimacy. He also brought the Catholic Church back, and the Catholic Church accepted him as the legitimate monarch. So what does this have to do with the Empire and the New Republic, now that I've kind of rambled off? The Empire was never able to solve the issue of legitimacy. If anything, I think Palpatine was against solving the issue of legitimacy because he viewed the whole thing as his goal was to have everything based solely around his personality, his personal charisma, his personal kind of power. Beyond that, there wasn't much backing the imperial government. At first, it had a bit of legitimacy because you still had the Senate and the inertia of the Republic. People kind of saw it as the successor to the Republic, which had stood for 10,000 years. However, over time, as they stripped power away from the Senate and gave more and more power to the military and eventually dissolved it, Palpatine's government lost all the legitimacy of the tradition of the accepted, the old Republic, the old Constitution, and the worlds were no longer able to have even a token representation. Representation is necessary. Whether you want it to be democratic or selective or just the elite, people, like I said, have to be able to have their concerns heard. Because people have legitimate grievances. Maybe it's even something like, there's a pothole in front of my house, or there's bandits, or there needs to be more regulation of the salt market. People need to have a way to go to the government and ask them for redress. And under the later Galactic Empire, there was no way to do this. Palpatine's regime was very arbitrary. The form of government was almost entirely based on his whims. People were selected, and this is very common in military regimes, based on their loyalty and not their competency. Because all that really matters under a government that makes no real attempt at legitimacy is that the people are willing to do what you tell them to do. And if you ever notice, generally speaking, military regimes perform really poorly during wars. Like Chiang Kai shek's regime consistently performed really poorly against the communists, etc. Because, as with a lot of governments, similar governments, it's solely based on whoever will follow orders. And these kind of people who tend to be sycophants, who tend to be willing to just do whatever, also tend to be the first to kind of cave in and run away when things get bad. Because you want cowardly, weak men, but cowardly, weak men don't necessarily fight. So these states tend to perform very poorly, whereas a lot of like regimes like communist China drew their legitimacy not just from Mao, but from this idea that they were all within from the ideology of communism itself, and that they were going to make China strong again. Totalitarian regimes have the benefit of having a lot of legitimacy in comparison to, I guess, kind of more traditional military dictatorships. So you kind of had all these issues. Corruption was rampant. Like I said, the form of government kept changing. The power of the mobs, the power of the military, etc. And kind of by the end of it, like I said, it just became a flat out military dictatorship. They got rid of the Senate and all forms of representation. And the local governors just ruled through terror and military occupation. And I think in part the reason why the empire was unable to, other than just the warlords, to bring their full might to bear and crush the new republic and the rebel alliance beforehand, was because they had to actively occupy pretty much every world in imperial space. Pretty much every world they had to have a garrison on and actively repress the local population. Now, the Old Republic didn't have that issue. They didn't have to garrison virtually any of their worlds. The worlds were voluntarily part of it and accepted it as their legitimate form of galactic government, so there wasn't really any risk to not occupying worlds. Garrisons were placed on strategic worlds to protect from pirates, or when the Sith were still around, kind of like fortress frontier worlds. But in general, it wasn't really an issue that they had to militarily repress the individual member states. So that's why the army was a lot smaller during the Old Republic era, and it didn't really... Like, the Empire had this massive war machine, but the vast majority of it was used for internal repression. There's also the issue of human centrism, where when humans are not a majority, I don't know what size portion of the galaxy is human. I normally think like 20 to 30%. They're a sizable plurality, but not really a majority. I'd imagine humans and near humans are like 40% or something, but it doesn't really matter. The point is, when you have a society that's majority non-human and you actively repress them and don't deny them citizenship, that's inherently really unstable. So like large portions of imperial space literally, like I said, had to be militarily occupied and actively repressed. And that massively drained their military resource. It's very hard to pull large offensive fleets together when almost like 70, 80, 90% of your forces are actively repressing planets. And when Palpatine was still alive, his personal abilities and fear of him was able to keep everything in line. But once he died, the complete lack of legitimacy meant that the government couldn't continue and it collapsed. So we come to the New Republic, and I think I've kind of led up to it. I know this is like 15 minutes. I'm just getting into it now, but hopefully I've kind of built the foundation here. So the New Republic was kind of a mixed bag. On one hand, I think they tried their best to embrace the best of the Old Republic. Membership was voluntary. It was very decentralized. They didn't really try to impose anything on the member worlds. Member worlds were able to remain monarchies, socialist states, corporate states. The New Republic really didn't do anything to impose a particular form of government on member states. If it seems a bit more like a galactic blender than the Old Republic did, I think a lot of that was because they were dealing with a post-imperial era. The Empire had done a lot of damage to local cultures. They had destroyed a lot of kind of the local monarchies, the local forms of government, and imposed direct military rule within a rigid hierarchy and actively, like I said, repressed or destroyed local cultures. So, kind of when the New Republic was trying to fill in the gaps, I think a lot of the planets within it became necessarily galacticized. You can't say globalized because it's a galaxy, but galacticized or whatever. And they became more multicultural just because the local cultures had been destroyed under the Empire. So, since membership was voluntary and the New Republic enjoyed a lot of legitimacy with regards to its member states, they had the advantage of not having to actively repress virtually any of the space they controlled. The worlds they freed from the Empire would either join or just become neutral. So, like I said, all the worlds were in there voluntarily, so their entire navy was free for dealing with the Empire, for garrisoning important, militarily, strategically important worlds, and for dealing with pirates and terrorists and that kind of thing. So that was all very helpful to them. That let them more efficiently use their admittedly much smaller military resources. Like, it was very difficult for the New Republic when they started building their own Star Dreadnoughts, the Star Defender class, to actually get the resources together to build it. The Empire was able to build super weapons. They were able to build all these like super large projects, but at the same time, to what end? They had to use a lot of it to blow their own planets up through things like the Death Star or Base Delta Zero, I think it's called. Whereas the New Republic was able to use all of its fleet in a more useful role. Now, once again, the issue is they weren't able to effectively marshal the resources in the same way the Empire did. They had to rely on the different planets accepting taxation and being willing to donate forces. On the other hand, though, because the planets, most of them had been independent beforehand, a lot of them had their own planetary defense forces. They had their own ships. They maybe had some I don't know, anti-starship guns on the planet, maybe a couple orbital defense platforms. So the New Republic didn't necessarily have to provide direct military support, or they'd come under the direction of a sector fleet, and it was just one extra planet to enforce, and the taxes from the new planet would help offset the cost of it. Some of them, like Corellia, had large existing fleets, and they gave part of their fleet to the New Republic, or just became the New Republic fleet within their sector. So, unlike the Empire, where gaining a new planet meant you had to actively repress it and forcibly conscript or extract resources, whenever a new world would join the New Republic, it would benefit them by probably providing military resources and tax revenue to it legitimately. So that was all very helpful. Now, the general issue and the problem they had was, like I said, the problem with establishing kind of this new government amidst the cultural devastation that had occurred under the Empire, where, like I said, they had tried to impose this minimalistic, militaristic, kind of bland culture on all of the galaxy. I think in a lot of ways the Galactic Empire was all like kind of Maoist China, where you had the Cultural Revolution in which everything old was swept anew in favor of the new order. So, yeah, you had that issue. Some other issues that the New Republic had was the Old Republic drew a lot of its legitimacy from the fact it was really, really old. As far back as recorded history went, the Old Republic had always been a thing. It was widely accepted that it had always existed and it always would exist. While people had the same hopes from the New Republic, they didn't have any of this inertia or these traditions or this stuff that was built up over thousands of years. Like, that's kind of like how common law works. Common law is something that actively evolves over time. Different decisions kind of can shift the course of it. The various kind of stuff builds on each other and builds on each other, and common law kind of gets better as time goes on. At least theoretically, it's this evolving thing. And the New Republic had to try to kind of start this all from scratch amidst, like I said, a culturally devastated galaxy. There's also kind of the issue where they had to remain a highly militarized state, but that was not really their goal. Now, something they did achieve was a separation in military and civilian power, which proved very important because the New Republic was never really under the threat of military coups. That wasn't really a thing until much later with the Federation of Free Alliances, but that's another story. So unlike the various successor warlord states, because the government was civilian in nature and there was a separation between the two, and the militarily willingly accepted subordination to the civilian side, there wasn't this danger of military coups, there wasn't this danger of parts breaking off into its own warlord fleets, etc., unlike you had with the Empire. Like, the New Republic was even if it was kind of chaotic and there was a lot of political issues, there wasn't really a real threat of it completely failing to exist. There was threats to the current government collapsing and having new senators elected, but not really it falling apart, even during the document, I can never remember how to pronounce it, the Camus document crisis. That was a very big political issue, but I don't think there was any real threat of the whole thing just kind of disappearing in the same way the Empire went under a threat. Another issue the New Republic had was they were very reliant on the heroes of the Rebel era, Luke Skywalker, Leia, Mon Mothma, and it was difficult to kind of build a new political class, like I said, from scratch. It was hard to kind of build like new senators, to try to find politicians who took the principles of the rebellion and took the continual struggle seriously and weren't just career politicians or bureaucrats. Because there's a time for kind of where that kind of malaise and mediocrity isn't even really a bad thing, because it allows the various planets a lot of autonomy. But in a time of war, it's a bad thing to have these political squabbles. Like I said, none of them really endangered the Republic fundamentally, but they did hurt its military efforts and its expansion efforts in a time when both were really badly needed. So whereas the New Republic was kind of multicultural, was kind of politically confused, and had a lot of difficulty asserting its authority, it nevertheless was, I think, a lot more stable. The fact that you had the New Republic and it continued to be called the New Republic for the entire duration of the Galactic Civil War, and the fact that you had dozens of different imperial governments. You had Zinj, you had the Greater Maldridge, you had the Palpatine's Dark Empire, you had the Crimson Empire, you had Thrawn's Confederation, you had the New Warlords, you had Dala. You had all these different governments, none of which were really continuations of one another, that constantly broke apart and reformed. But through it all, you had the New Republic, and it was always the New Republic, even when they lost Coruscant. It remained the New Republic, and there was, like I said, never a serious threat of it disappearing, unless it was just overwhelmingly and completely militarily defeated. Unlike the Empire, with which, if it was shattered military, like it took enough military defeats, then the various planets would just secede, or the various sub-commanders would just break away. So that's kind of my thoughts on the New Republic. I don't think it's as bad as people think it is. I think if it had more time to kind of continue, it probably would have started to resemble the Old Republic more. It would have become more decentralized. The individual worlds would have started to reassert their individual cultures, and you would have kind of had a return to normalcy that you just couldn't really have, because the Galactic Civil War was still going on. And cleaning up the mess that was left behind was extremely difficult. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think, and I'll talk to you guys later.